Good morning. Welcome to Sunday Morning Science. John Perry here. I am very excited about today's presentation. I've got Jay Forsythe on with me. He is a assistant professor at the College of Charleston, and I met him when he was doing his postdoc with Georgia Tech at the Center for Chemical Evolution. So I've been working with the Center for Chemical Evolution since I think it was 2013 that I first started going, maybe it was 2014 that I first started going to their meetings and doing animations for them. So if you go to the Stated Clearly channel, you'll see a whole series of animations about the origin of life that I've done with them. And this center, it was located at Georgia Tech, but they have satellite groups all over the country, different research labs, and they've just been, for the past decade, been looking into the origin of life and doing all sorts of different experiments, exploring different aspects of the origin of life. And Jay has focused a lot on peptides, so the origin of different proteins. And we're going to talk a little bit about his technical work, but also just his experience in this. He comes from a Christian background. He is a Christian, and he has spent a lot of time doing outreach with Christian groups. Origin of life science, I've noticed over the years, I have a healthy chunk of my audience is Christian, and some of them they feel that their religious faith is at odds with things like evolution and origin of life research. And so we're going to be talking to Jay about kind of how he's navigated that in his own thinking. And Jay, welcome to Sunday Morning Science. I'm really glad to have you here.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited I can participate, and hopefully I can bring some helpful perspectives.
Yeah. And as always, audience, if you have questions, do at space stated casually, and I'll be able to answer those. We'll probably pause several times throughout the conversation and answer those. And if you're having trouble hearing or anything like that, just let me know there in the comments.
My
Now,
dog Hazel says hi also.
oh, great. So, Jay, just kind of to get started, I've worked for a bunch of different research centers now. I've worked with a lot of different scientists, and it's kind of funny because it's really hard to become a professor. It's really hard to get into research, but I've actually met quite a few researchers who sort of just fell into it. Like they were good at math when they were in middle school, and then they liked chemistry in high school, and just one thing led to another, and bam, they just kind of fell into this career, and they're not super excited about it. But at the Center for Chemical Evolution, it seems pretty much everybody is excited. I mean, I haven't met anyone there that I'm like, oh, this person isn't really that into what they're doing. It seems like everybody's really into this project. But you especially, you spent a lot of time with me, helping me get oriented in the field when I first started working with the center. And you're doing this outreach stuff with Christian groups, and that's through the what organization is that through?
It's through AAAS, which is the American Association for the Advancement of Science, right? So they're probably best known for being the publisher of the journal Science.
Yeah.
Right. But they're based in DC, and they do all kinds of policy work. They do all kinds of things.
Yeah. And then your what's the name of that program? The outreach program.
Well, specifically, one of the ones that I help out with is called the Science for Seminaries. So it's I don't run the program by any means. I'm just one of their helpful advisors. And basically what they do is they help train seminary professors how to incorporate science into their seminary courses, so that religious persons in the U.S. can kind of get more solid science content and kind of a better understanding of science, and also seeing how science can apply to things like psychology, right? Like for example, like when you have a religious community, a lot of times the persons in that community will go to their religious leader for personal advice, or even mental health issues and things like that, right? And so it's really important that they get good sound science. So I usually talk about chemistry topics or origins of life topics, but there are all kinds of scientists that participate and help out with that program.
Oh,
It's a really cool
yeah.
program.
Yeah, it sounds great. I've been interested in trying to do something with them as well, but it's never have. But so it's very clear that you go above and beyond in your outreach and stuff. You're very excited about this topic, and my first question to kind of start off the day is what got you interested in this? How long have you been interested in chemistry, and then specifically in the origin of life?
Yeah. So going back to what you said earlier, I would consider myself one of those people that kind of fell into it, but it was kind of one of those happy accidents, right?
Yeah.
Where so I guess I'll just talk about kind of how I grew up. So I grew up going to a very religious, small private school. Like it was private, but not like well funded.
Yeah.
And the science education I got there was not the best, to say. So basically, I was never taught the theory of evolution in class until I was a college student, right?
Hold on, I think our stream has stopped somehow.
Okay.
God. Let me ask a question here. God, what's going on? YouTube has been crazy with me today. Okay, someone says it's working now, but okay. All right, let's continue. Sorry about that interruption there.
No, it's okay. So yeah, so I grew up K through 12 at a very small religious school. Certain aspects of my education were really good. Like I felt like my liberal arts education was excellent. I felt like I was a pretty good writer for being a high school student. My math was very good, and so like we had calculus and stuff like that in high school, but my science was not. My chemistry labs were like putting peeps in a microwave and things like. I'm serious, like
Really?
really? I never, like when I was a college freshman and we did like real chemistry labs, like that's the first time I'd really ever done anything like that before.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. That's wow. Okay.
I definitely felt behind the curve when I started in college compared to a lot of my friends, and I was a chemistry major that were other chemistry majors, but I felt like we all kind of evened out quickly. Once you kind of get over some of those introductory courses, everybody's kind of jumping in from scratch, and so but I was always, I guess growing up, I was always a curious person, right? I was always asking questions. I was always thinking about the implications of what I was taught, and I started to, I guess, question some things that I was taught even while I was still in that school, right? So and there were people that helped me do that. One person I always think of was my ninth grade earth science teacher. His name was Mr. Whitwer, right? And I haven't spoken with him in 20 years. Yeah, I'm sure he's not listening to this, but
we could send him a link.
Yeah. So he basically taught that, he taught us plate tectonic theory and argued, like based on the Earth as it is, it seems very likely that the Earth is old, and the idea of like a young Earth creationism is not supported by the evidence, right?
Yeah.
And even that at my school was controversial, right? So he left I think a year or two after I had him, and I don't know what happened, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was pushed out based on like some of the parents not liking what he taught, right?
Yeah.
He did not teach evolution, right? He was just teaching old earth theory, right? Like he wasn't necessarily teaching anything on creationism. It was just saying, I don't think the Earth is 6,000 something years old.
Yeah. So evolution was totally banned in that school.
Yeah, well, yeah, like honestly, I think they just avoided it. It was one of those schools where when those small private schools, there's like a number of families, like the families basically run the school in a sense, and I think that they wanted to kind of avoid it because they were worried if people disagreed about it,
Yeah.
that would cause all this drama, right? And so I think they just avoided it. Like I do remember that we read Inherit the Wind, right?
Yeah.
The play on the Scopes trial, right?
Yeah.
I remember reading that in middle school, but I don't really remember if they made an argument of like who was the good guy and bad guy.
Yeah.
I feel like most people sided with the William Jennings Bryan side, I think, right?
Yeah.
Like standing firm in his faith, like
Right.
no matter what, right? But that's really all I remember, we talked about the theology related to like the creation story I came from a kind of more like evangelical, like persuasion, right? So kind of like the Genesis, like the first two chapters of Genesis,
Yeah.
right? And like kind of theological implications of those. I do remember being told that word day could be translated multiple ways, but
Right.
that was really it, right? That was as far as they ever went. And when I was in high school, I was starting to be interested in science, but I was a little frustrated just because I felt like my science teaching wasn't great. And I thought I was going to be a doctor. And so I was like, oh, I'm going to go be a chemistry major and then go to med school.
Yeah.
And so I went to college and I started taking like chemistry and biology. And I fell in love with science. I knew that was what I wanted to do and do more like pure science as opposed to medicine. Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
A lot of my friends went off to med school too. And my freshman biology class was where I did learn the theory of evolution for the first time. And I thought it was fascinating. I thought it was amazing. It's one of those, it's such a grand idea, but yet it's so like simple and clean too. Like it has this, like, I don't know, some of my favorite scientific ideas are, they're huge and they change how you see everything, but you can explain it in a sentence or two, right?
Right.
Like there's this profoundness yet a simplicity to it. And I knew right away. I was like, oh yeah, like this is awesome. Like this, I really think this happened, right? And I wouldn't really say it changed my faith per se. Like I guess my faith was already evolving in a sense even before that. I was becoming more open-minded in terms of kind of like seeing things from other people's perspectives, right? And the kind of the more evangelical tradition that I grew up in was, it was very like the theology behind it was very personal, like this is like you and God, and it's not about anybody else, in a sense. And like my faith became more of the opposite. Like I felt like I wanted to have like more of a communal idea, right? And so I guess my faith was still there, but it was changing. Yeah. And so by the time that I started learning evolution, it didn't really throw me into shock, right? And I know it does. I had conversations with people all the way back in college at the same time we were taking that class that it did, right?
Yeah.
And so I know that happens a lot, but I guess my spirituality was starting to morph maybe even before like that hit me. And so I think I was kind of maybe a little more ready for that lesson.
Yeah, that's really interesting because the a lot of people, they just, evolution is just this. It's either evolution or it's God. And I find it really interesting that you were, because you're in Tennessee, right?
Well, so I'm in South Carolina now.
No, but you were raised in Tennessee, right?
I was born in Tennessee. I actually was raised outside in the suburbs of Philadelphia, but I moved back south. Yeah. So I went to college in South Carolina and then grad school in Tennessee. So yeah, I've spent about half my life in the north and half in the south.
Yeah. Well, I lived in Tennessee, and that's actually when I started the Stated Clearly project. And it was because so many of my friends were really, really anti-evolution, and I was trying to share stuff with them about it, but all the textbooks were too technical. And then
Hmm.
if I were to share them like a video by Richard Dawkins or something, it'd be peppered with insults towards
Yeah.
Christianity. So I'm like, well, yeah, there's nothing really good here. That's so I started the Stated Clearly project, and I mean that was the genesis of it.
Hmm.
So yeah, a lot of people have had that really really strong. It's either God or it's evolution, and I think that's a kind of a horrible dichotomy there. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's
And
really interesting that it wasn't even an issue for you.
yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, it was definitely something I've spent a lot of time thinking about, but it was never this like internal struggle, I would say. I was also fortunate to find, some voices like, like through like writing or like, different places that were kind of, they were either saying that, like religion and science can coexist, right? That
Hmm.
they ask and answer different questions. That's kind of more of like the Stephen Jay Gould idea, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, or like there are some very prominent Christians and religious persons who are highly respected scientists who argue for evolution. Probably the best known one is the creator of BioLogos, Francis Collins, right? So
yeah,
he's
yeah,
the head of NIH, right?
yeah. He did. He
And
he he headed the Human Genome
Genome
Project
Project.
for
Yeah,
the federal side.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, he
I've written
wasn't.
for
Yeah,
BioLogos.
yeah.
I don't know if I ever sent that to
Um,
you, but yeah,
Yeah, and I think that like his perspective and Stephen Jay Gould's perspective, all they're kind of in between. Both of them are kind of in between that either like it's only God or it's only evolution, right? Um, and their perspectives disagree with each other on some places, and in some places they agree. Like I guess I almost find myself kind of in between those two in some ways.
yeah,
Like I think that Stephen Jay Gould would argue he had his term he termed it noma. It's like non-overlapping magisteria, right?
yeah,
And it's basically like theology or religion or spirituality and science. They're just different spheres of questions and ways of knowing, right?
yeah,
And they don't overlap, right? And that means that they can coexist. And then I think that Francis Collins would probably argue that he almost sees his science as like a calling, as like it's almost like his vocation, and like
right,
he finds meaning, spiritual meaning and purpose through his scientific work, right?
yeah,
And I kind of see both sides of those two arguments too, like like part of me, like I think that I really like origins of life research because of my background, right? I think it's really fascinating, and it does raise a lot of interesting questions, and I like exploring that. I like diving into that space. I'm just really curious. I like big questions.
right,
But also, like I work with people of no faith, unsure, all other faiths. I work with people from all different backgrounds, and I don't think that you have to have a faith to like find meaning in your science either,
right,
right?
right.
Like I think there's value in the work no matter where you come from. Yeah.
Well, if you look at the history of science in the West, and all of our history books, if you read on science, it's totally skewed towards Europe. But
Mhm.
the tradition there was it was a Christian tradition where people they're like, okay, there's the Bible that's God's word, and then there's the actual universe around us that's God's creation. So we can worship God by studying creation, and it was through that mindset that they became very strict with. We need to demonstrate every claim needs to be demonstrated by observations. You have nullius in verba, which came about.
Mhm.
That was the slogan for the Royal Society, and that means take no one's word. So they were super strict because they realized it's really easy to misinterpret observations in the universe. And people fight over how to interpret the Bible, and that's just written in normal language. Imagine how hard it should be to interpret nature. So it was actually under that it was that Christian perspective that was driving a lot of people. Obviously, not everyone at that time, and so yeah, it's not a surprise to me to hear that you find that there's a sort of a calling in your science for you, and with Stephen Jay Gould's non-overlapping, his argument, he argues that science and religion don't overlap, but of course, if you look at just how people deal with science and religion, for a lot of people it does, right? For a lot of
Yeah.
people,
Yes.
so I think Gould's idea was like I don't know, maybe wishful thinking is one way to say it, or maybe he was proposing how it should be. But
Yeah.
obviously, if you look at how people actually deal with this, it's not how it works. And so I've been really interested in BioLogos, which is this group that set up this forum to talk about evolution in the Christian world. And yeah, I'm really interested in, and all the conversations I've had with you have been really fascinating on this topic too. So yeah, I'm really glad to have you here talking about this.
Yeah,
So,
your mention of interpretation is really important, and that actually brings me back to I had one of my other really great teachers that I had at that religious school when growing up. He was actually a Bible teacher, and but I think he has some connections to like science. Maybe he grew up in like a science family or something. And I had him in high school, and he told my class, he said, like everything that's written in the Bible is translated. If at time, like especially a lot of the old stories were passed down verbally before they were ever written down, right? And then they were translated and retranslated, and a lot of the priests would change things as they like when they were translating it because they interpreted something differly,
yeah.
and
Well, and
he said,
just plain telephone,
yeah, exactly, right. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that was the cultural norm back. That was not a problem, right?
Yeah.
And that was how information was passed. And I guess that he helped me realize that like the importance of interpretation. And a lot of times, religious persons told me the Bible says this, right? And even at a youngish age, I was like, where? Show me, right? And when they show you, you're like, well, does it? Like it kind of says this too. Like you could take this multiple ways, right? And in truth, and like a religious textbook like the Bible is really a combination of a bunch of books written by tons of people. And sometimes the Bible says different things on the same issue, and you have to weigh you find nuance, or maybe it doesn't come to a consensus on this issue. It just wrestles with the conflict on something, right? And being not afraid to embrace that, and looking for more complex answers than just it says this, right? I think that was actually something really important for me. Again, that didn't happen in a science class, right? But affected how I interpreted things, and also going back to the kind of interpretation on nature and relating it to religion. Saying how you when you said you think of if nature was created, and however it was created, right? You think it would have some type of reflection on the entity that created it, right?
Right.
And
yeah.
that and learning about that would mean that you're learning about its creator. I think there's a lot personal, from my personal opinion, right? I can't speak for anybody else, but I think that's a really important idea too, and I tell my students, I'm not a genius, if God, in whatever form you believe exists, right? I'm sure that God is smart enough to answer my stupid questions, right?
Yeah.
I'm never going to ask a question that stumps God, right?
Right.
And
Okay.
so,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to I'm not smart enough to do that. And in truth, Darwin had I'm sure you probably heard of Darwin's quote on matters like this. He said, he felt like he was a dog. It would be like a dog thinking about the mind of Newton, right? You know,
Yeah.
like, right, like I like personally, I am religious, and I believe that my God can handle my questions about the origin of life, or about space, about existence, about anything, right? You know, and
Dinosaurs. Yeah.
dinosaurs, right? Yeah, and in a sense, like I find that very freeing, and you know, I feel like I can explore different questions, and nothing that I find is going to like it's going to be like, oh my gosh, I'm going to have this like crisis of faith because now I discovered this, right? You know,
Yeah.
like yeah, and that's my perspective. You know, I know other people have different thoughts on that.
Yeah. That's cool. So we've gotten a couple questions from live viewers here. And I just wanted to address these real quick before we move on. But we
Sure.
got Otis asks, genes first, metabolism first, or is that a false dichotomy?
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. So I beforehand, I made a little note of things I was wondering topics that would come up, and that was actually one of them. I wrote metabolism first, replication. Yeah. Yeah, I mean that in my opinion, I think that there's room for both of those areas of research, right? You know, I think it's
Yeah.
much too early to know for sure. And in truth, I guess I think that the origins of life field, like different people sometimes have different like their own theories on how things worked, but I think there's space for all these ideas, right? I
Yeah.
just don't think we're far enough along to be able to say gene first, or to be able to say metabolism first. You know, I think
Yeah.
that there's really cool work going on in both fields, and to kind of just like put one away and focus on the other one, I think would be a huge mistake. And so,
Yeah,
my
me too.
personal
Especially at this
opinion,
point. Yeah.
yeah, you know, my personal opinion, you know, I guess that I work, my research is kind of more in the RNA slash peptide kind of like combined world first, right?
Hmm.
Um, and you know, like when you look at the ribosome, like how RNA and you know like short peptides are really kind of at the heart of it, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like somebody like Lauren Williams at Georgia Tech is really like a pioneer in that field. Um, you know, I think that that idea has a lot of potential merit to it, but I'm completely open to metabolism first also, right? You
Yeah.
know, when you, yeah, I personally would not argue one or the other
So
that hard. Yeah.
yeah, I just want to spend a few seconds here explaining what this means for people that might not understand. So the metabolism first idea is this idea that some aspect of metabolism that cells are using today may have came before genes, and so it's kind of it's kind of weird to even ask metabolism first versus gene first because obviously there was not a full cellular metabolism before there were genes. I mean, and there were not modern genes in the start. So whatever we're looking at in the origin of life, there's going to be like hints of what there is today, but it's going to be very different. So and you could actually kind of define any sort of chemistry as metabolism if molecules are being transformed from one thing to another. So it gets a little bit tricky, and because of that, I've actually been working with Greg Springsteen on a video about the metabolism first hypothesis, and that's going to be published as soon as his paper gets approved for publishing. I've got the video almost ready right now, and so probably hopefully in the next couple of weeks, we will have a full video on that explaining that whole perspective, what's even meant by metabolism first. So yeah, I'm very excited, and I've been I've been thinking about this for months now. So
Yeah,
it's
that's a great question. Yeah.
yeah. And then the other question was from the higher evolutionary. They ask, John and Dr. J, can you both touch on your religious peers' view of your academic experience? So, I mean, I'm not religious. Jay is but I do have lots of religious peers. Like my family is religious, but I'm gonna turn that over to you. So,
Sure.
Jay.
Right. So I mean, my family is very religious, right? My coworkers, I would say, you know, some of them are, some of them are not. in terms and researchers in the origins field, I would say, perhaps a majority would probably declare themselves agnostic or atheist, but not a huge majority, right? I think there's a lot of religious persons that work on these types of problems just like me, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. At the center, there's a
Yeah,
lot. There's
yeah. I mean, I won't name specific names just for their privacy, but I could go down the list very quickly and name
yeah,
a lot of people, very prominent origins of life researchers.
yeah,
Um, I've never had anyone ever, at least to my face, make fun of me or anything for my views.
yeah,
Right. I think if you talk to most scientists, they would say just accepting of scientific, like current scientific thought, or think, like well established theories like evolution and things like that. Like if you do that, like we're good,
yeah,
like I can have my personal other views and you can have yours, right? But if you accept the basic science, like for what it is, right? I think most scientists are happy with that, like,
yeah,
because in truth, like I think one just needs to look at the United States now, right? Is there's a lot of people that don't necessarily accept basic science for what it is, right?
yeah, yeah,
And so that, I think that's our common denominator, right? And I like I'm sure that there are some hardcore atheists that wouldn't agree with the fact that I can be religious and still be an origins of life scientist, but I feel like that number would be very small, actually.
yeah, yeah. In the meetings that I've been to with the center, how many people work in the Center for Chemical Evolution at a
I'd say
time?
in terms of like all like students and postdoctoral fellows and professors and things, probably 100,
Yeah,
maybe more. Yeah.
yeah. And so when we go to these meetings, topic of religion comes up sometimes at the bar after meetings, um,
Mhm.
but it's always been really respectful when it because there are a lot. So there's at the center you got a pretty good mix of religions too. You've got I was there for one time I was during Lent, and so it was super obvious who all was Catholic because they were ordering fish. But
Mhm.
then there's quite a few, I guess you'd say Protestants. Is that how you would, if you had to categorize yourself, would you say you're Protestant?
Yeah. So, I would say that I grew up evangelical. I would say that I'm no longer evangelical. I'm
Yeah.
a mainline Protestant.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then there's you've got Hindus, quite a few Hindus at the center. You've got
Mhm.
yeah, and several other people that I've spoken with that they practice various either Eastern religions or more traditional kind of folk religions too. So, and then of course there's a healthy chunk of atheists at the center. But everybody, I was really impressed with the center because there was a documentary, I think it was by Nova or something, that came out a while ago about origin of life research, and the whole thing was just interviewing people independently, and they all seemed to hate all the other researchers. This was done back in probably in like the 90s or something, and they were interviewing different labs that were studying conflicting ideas, and they were very mean to each other, and I kind of figured that this field was going to be like that, and that's not the case at all. Like it was, at my first encounter with the center was with Nick Hudd, who's the director, and then Ram Krishnamurthy, and then I started going to the meetings, and it's like, wow, this whole group is. I mean, people have heated scientific debates quite often, but it kind of felt like almost like a family group. It was really neat coming in and seeing this center and seeing what you guys are doing. So
It still feels like a family. They're like my
yeah,
science family.
yeah,
Seriously, like I feel that way. And um, so this year is actually the last year of the Center for
I
Chemical
know.
Evolution, right? So National Science
uh,
Foundation grants like that have a 10-year period so you can get up to 10 years of funding, and then they permanently sunset those so that
yeah,
they can fund new projects and new endeavors and things like that, which I think is very important. It's important to mix it up. You don't want to just work on one thing forever.
yeah,
Or at least fund one thing forever, right? Like there are so many other big problems that need basic science research. And so
Yeah.
I'm not necessarily mad that it's being sunsetted, but I am a little like, personally, I'm a little disappointed. These are you're right. This is my science family. I've been working, collaborating with these people for 6 years. That's a long time. And we've made some really cool discoveries, but I've made a lot of good friends, and
Yeah.
some of my best career mentors are still like, or that's where we met, right? These are people who helped me get my job. And when I like write grant proposals, like, like write, like they'll like, like if we're going to collaborate on a grant, they'll like write a letter of support that you tag on the end saying like, I'm going to work with Jay and we're going to do this. Right.
Yeah.
And so those connections are going to last long after the CCE does. Right. And so
Yeah.
we're going to like, I'm going to continue to work with people after we're done, I'm sure. And even if we don't necessarily like work on a paper together, I'm still going to ask them, hey, I wrote this. Can you take a look at it and review it? Or like kind of like give me edits or comments, or
Yeah.
hey, like my friend is looking for a job in this field. Do you know anybody who might want them? Things like that. Like those connections are going to go my entire scientific career.
Yeah. Yeah. We're getting a lot of technical, it's like more science related questions here. And I
Yeah,
want
sure.
to, let's see. There was another question I had though before we get into the technicalities of everything. Well, so a lot of people are asking about specific hypotheses like the warm little pond. That was
Mm-hmm.
the warm little pond is just a letter that Darwin wrote to, I can't remember who he's writing it to, but
I
the
think it was Joseph Hooker, if I remember correctly.
okay, yeah, the
Yep.
botanist, right? And so that was just Darwin just supposed, maybe life got started in a warm little pond with, the chemistry in there being just right. And actually, I would say that your wet dry cycle work is pretty much in that model, right? Um,
Yes. Yeah. So, do
but
you want me to talk about that a little bit,
yeah,
or?
yeah, just here in a second. But I just kind
Sure.
of to give people kind of a basic overview. You'll hear things about like the RNA world hypothesis, and Jay mentioned today there's a combined peptide RNA world hypothesis that a lot of people are now paying more attention to. So the idea that short proteins, tiny little proteins, were being produced naturally in the environment along with small chains of RNA or something similar to RNA. A lot of people are studying proto-RNA now.
Yeah.
And that these very different types of molecules were acting in some sort of symbiotic way that ended up being beneficial for both of them and kickstarting what we now know as life. So the ribosome, the core, the structure inside the cell that reads genes and uses that information to build proteins, that structure is made out of RNA with little proteins giving it its structure. And so we think, well, how would you get something like this to originate? Well, you would need RNA or something similar to RNA, and you would need short proteins or something similar to short proteins that are finding each other in this environment, attaching to each other, and forming various shapes until you get one that's just like this ribosome that can actually help build proteins. So the thing that we don't, well, actually, I should probably just ask you this. What would you say is the big unanswered question about the origin of life? The big thing that if we could answer this one question, everybody would open up their champagne and laboratories all around the world, origin of life laboratories, and we might even be like, okay, we've solved the origin of life to a degree that's satisfying. What would that question be?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. Honestly, I think there's multiple things that would be like that,
Yeah,
right? I don't think there's just one. I think one of the biggest ones is, has to do with replication, right?
yeah,
And like true molecular evolution, right? So starting with these simple building blocks and having them self-assemble into something like the RNA, right? And then having like something just really simple in that is basically like a self-replicator where it can make copies of itself
Yeah.
and keep that information going, right?
Right. So
I think that we're making a
open-ended
lot of
evolution.
yeah, I think we're making a lot of progress on that front, to be honest.
Yeah.
But I think there's a long ways to go.
Yeah.
I think that would be a huge hit, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And that's what I hear from most people. So people are looking for a system that's prebiotically plausible. So it could have happened on a lifeless planet and gives rise to a system capable of open-ended Darwinian evolution. So it's evolving through descent with modification, acted upon
yeah,
by natural selection. Because if you have a truly open-ended system, then you can get things like symbiosis to evolve. You can get things like the genetic code to emerge. The genetic code is this communication system between really the genome and the ribosome. And so long as you have Darwinian evolution going, we know how symbiosis evolves. We know how cooperation evolves. We know how all these things happen. So if you can get a system capable of Darwinian evolution, open-ended Darwinian evolution, then life it's on its way, right?
yeah.
So
I think the ribosome itself, and
yeah,
I think that's a huge area of huge importance. I mean, that's an area of huge importance.
yeah,
And two,
yeah,
the idea to have encoded information and like taking all those letters of RNA and kicking out those little amino acids and stitching them together to make proteins, which are basically the machines of life, right? Proteins
right,
are what we call enzymes, right? When you take a drug, that drug molecule is interacting with a protein, right? They basically carry out the functions of life in all life that we know, like little worms and little microbes in us, and so
right.
I think the ribosome itself is also very important. And I think it's so the middle part of it is it's almost like a chemical fossil, right?
That like
Like
the core of the ribosome.
the
Yeah.
core of the ribosome. That's
Mm-hmm.
right, and it basically almost tells us about like what those molecules were for what we call LUCA, like like the oldest common ancestor that we
Right.
have, right?
Right.
Um,
Because all organisms today, except for viruses, have ribosomes, but viruses use our ribosomes. That's why viruses are
they exploit
parasitic.
ours, right?
They
Yes,
have
that's
to
right.
use
Yeah.
them. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, and the whole question of is a virus alive, right? So
Yeah.
that's an interesting question on its own. I'm
Yeah.
teaching an Origins of Life class this fall to college freshmen, and I'm going to make them write papers and argue whether coronavirus is alive or not.
Cool. That's
So
perfect.
I think that'll be fun.
Yeah. So that there's a lot of people that want to get that they're going to be satisfied and even like maybe even be like, okay, we're done doing this research if you can get to an open-ended evolving system that is prebiotically plausible. Others want to get all the way to a ribosome or an analog to the ribosome, so that this this to get information transfer between unlike molecules.
Yes.
And but those are kind of those are like the two big things that I hear mostly when I'm talking to Origin of Life chemists.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that I think that metabolism field also has some potential big hits.
Yeah.
Being able to, like when we think of like really kind of fundamental biological cycles, like the citric acid cycle, right?
Yeah.
Like people like Greg Springsteen are basically trying to kind of come up with like a simplified version of their own,
Mm.
where they can like go around the cycle multiple times and reproduce these like molecules coming in and out. I think that's
Yeah.
I think that's huge, honestly. I think that's really cool.
Yeah. So in the comments, I'm getting a lot of stuff about specific, like people are asking about hydrothermal vents, warm little pond, and one of the things that I would just say on that is that we have. It's not. I don't think it's super helpful to get wedded to a specific microenvironment where the origin of life happened. Right now, we're still exploring chemistry and thinking we're trying to figure out what types of reactions can produce the things that are eventually able to evolve. And when we've really found a system that can work, then we would worry about what type of specific microenvironment can actually cause that to happen. I think it's kind of like it's a distraction to worry about that right now because we don't have a model that works start to finish. So to try and say what specific, did it happen on Earth? Did it happen on a meteorite? Did it happen in a pond or at the bottom of the ocean? I guess those things are interesting to think about, but maybe a little bit of a distraction. I don't know what your thoughts
Yeah, I
are
mean,
on that.
I would argue that we should study all of those things,
Yeah.
right? I think that again, like focusing on one of those environments is too narrow, and the truth is we just don't know a lot about those early Earth environments. Like we've learned a lot recently, but there's so much more we don't know. Um, like the early Earth was likely, like it likely had a different atmosphere, right? We think that maybe the oceans were a little more acidic. It might have been hotter. There was a lot of volcanism, like a lot of like meteorite falls and things like that. But like, yeah, I mean, and I'll be the first person to admit I am not a geologist. So,
Yeah.
but it seems like there's a lot we don't know about the early Earth, and so
Right.
like you said, to kind of focus on one environment right now, I think is maybe the wrong idea. I think, but also like I think if people have expertise in hydrothermal vents, then they should focus on that. That's their expertise, right? And then
Yeah.
if people have focus like an expertise in more like warm little pond, like the research I do is more of like a warm little pond, I would argue.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I'm open to all of those ideas.
Well,
I think that
I,
I
I,
think. Sorry, go ahead.
I would say that the reason it can be a distraction is because the early Earth, just like modern Earth, was a huge place with millions of environments, and so if we can get our clues from the chemistry itself, I think that's probably the best way to go right now. I mean, that's where I would spend my energy. I think because there are millions of possible places you could look, like microenvironments you could study and try and simulate in the lab, it almost doesn't. It's like you're just throwing darts at a board, kind of. So that's why I think that really focusing on the chemistry, what types of temperatures are needed to get, RNA to bind with, with its counterpart, and things like this are these are the type of questions that I think are most helpful. That the center seems to be focusing a lot on, and it seems like that's what Greg's work is really doing when he's looking at metabolism first. He's looking at, okay, these are the reactions that cells do today. Can we get those to happen without enzymes, without biological molecules controlling all of these reactions? Yes or no? The answer is yes. What are the pH and temperature requirements? And so doing that, you can actually then show those requirements to a geologist and say, hey, which types of environments could do this? And then you can simulate those environments. And so there's this kind of back and forth that you can do to get at these answers. It's like doing a puzzle that if you just focus on one little spot, you're not going to find all the pieces. You kind of need to go wherever you're finding pieces that fit together, kind of build out from there. And there's right now, I'd say there's not. We don't have a system that works start to finish. It's kind of all over the place, in origin of life. But I'm seeing this kind of puzzle fill out, and different aspects of it are connecting with each other. And it's been really, really cool to see. Even just over the few years I've been working with the center, I've seen just things fill out really nicely.
Yeah, I'd like to add a couple quick things to that. First of all, when you think of like a hydrothermal vent versus a warm little pond or a meteorite, right?
Yeah.
All three of those environments, like it's very easy to figure out how a molecule like an amino acid could form in any of those environments, right?
Right.
And so like a lot of the building blocks of life as we know it here on Earth, a lot of those small molecules kind of have almost like a universality to them, right? Like a lot of the amino acids that are in you and I are formed on meteorite, like formed in outer space, and they're like transfer on meteorites. And when they fall to Earth, like when we drill in there and analyze them, like a lot of them have amino acids in them, right?
Right.
And so the idea that like I like what you said about kind of like focusing on like the more fundamental chemistry, because I think that there are fundamental chemistry processes associated with life that could have happened in any of those environments, or all, or maybe happened in all of them, right?
Yeah.
And I think that also has interesting implications for our search for life elsewhere through like NASA missions and things like that, right? Like, what are we looking for when we send probes to different planets and moons and things? Yeah.
Cool. I've got one more question. People are asking about James Tour. Do you know who James Tour is? He's been
Not by
outspoken.
name.
He's a chemist at Rice University. Who he's not an origin of life chemist, but he goes and he does speaking tours at churches saying that it's all a bunch of garbage. And
Oh yeah.
so I've actually talked with James because he was using, okay, turns out he was not using it, but he was on a video done by the Discovery Institute, which is the intelligent design group.
In the group in Kentucky, or
I think they're in Seattle, Washington, actually.
okay.
But they'd done a video about how the origin of life is all fake, and it's that scientists are in a conspiracy to, trick the public into thinking that the origin of life has already been figured out.
It's like fake moon landing stuff.
Yeah, which is hilarious because, if the scientists studying the origin of life trick the public into thinking the problem's already solved, they're going to lose their funding because, yeah. So anyway,
it's not already solved. I'll admit it, right?
No, the origin of life
solved.
is an unsolved mystery. That's why people are so interested in it. So, but he had used, well, okay, he didn't use it. The video took chunk of one of my animations and completely quoted it out of context. They made it look like I was saying that an abiotic membrane was a living cell, and then James Tour was making fun of that idea, and it was the way they'd edited it all together. So it made me think that James had like seen my entire video and was specifically talking about that. So I actually, he and I talked. We probably talked for like an hour, but he has had. He's in a mindset that if origin of life can happen naturally, then his religion is doomed. He doesn't say that if you ask him, but his
actions say
his actions suggest that. And talking to him, you said that you've had a positive experience even working with atheists and so on. Like he had a genuinely bad experience with that, and I think that's really colored his view on this, and I've heard that people that honestly I have people like to cry persecution sometimes even when it's not warranted, but that there are some stories that I've heard where people really do get picked on in serious ways, even in career ruining ways because of their religious ideas. That's definitely happened before, and something similar to that. I don't want to put words in his mouth because he's not here to talk about it, but like he's definitely had some problems in the past with the secular community and science, and so I can kind of understand his frustration. But the arguments that he makes, he's not an origin of life chemist. He really pretends to be in his talks, and it's kind of disturbing to see him do that. But the arguments that he's making really come from ignorance. He's not familiar with the literature. And when I was talking to him about this, he had made a statement that there was no progress in origin of life since the Miller-Urey experiment. And I sent him a bunch of papers, and he said, okay, well, I hadn't seen this, I hadn't seen that. So anyway, I don't know what his future is going to be if he's going to continue doing that, but it is quite obnoxious because he's posting these videos on YouTube and stuff. But anyway, I don't want to get derailed by talking about that.
I don't want to speculate on someone I don't know anything about, and so
So I am very much aware of that guy. Like he and I have spoken, and we actually spoken several times. And he does really good chemistry outreach too. He had really good stuff. Actually, before I started doing online education, I bumped into his work. He was synthesizing these molecules that were the shape of people. And he would use that to get kids excited about chemistry. So he had a whole video series on YouTube about chemistry that was really cool. So it's unfortunate to see that he's like, kind of has this bitterness now, because he really is, he's good at what he does. He's a synthetic chemist, and he's done some really cool stuff. So I want to talk about, kind of the meat and potatoes of your research, really with the depsipeptides and the wet dry cycles, which again, you're saying is kind of the warm little pond. That's the type of environment that would cause these to happen. And
Sure.
I might interrupt you a little bit to try and, when we start to get a little bit too jargon rich, I think even like words like peptide can be confusing. So I like to talk about chains of molecules instead of peptide and so on. So let's dig into this. And really, how is your research addressing this larger question of how do we get evolving molecules, like open-ended Darwinian evolution?
When you think of biology, right, biology is really just kind of like a system of chemistry on a grand scale that can reproduce and evolve and things like that, right? So biological molecules include things like DNA, which most people are familiar with, right? DNA is the information storage of life, right? And then you have RNA, which RNA is basically like the transition between the stored information and proteins, which basically are the machines of life, right? So RNA is what kind of reads the DNA and kicks out and like leads to, like through the ribosome, kicks out proteins, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you have other like small molecules. We have things like fats, right? People a lot of times call those lipids, right? And they make up the walls of our cells, like we call them membranes, right? And they're all other kinds of biological molecules, but kind of the kind of like the holy grail of biology is like DNA, RNA, and protein, right? And so I study how proteins could have chemically evolved before there were any ribosomes, which were the machines that make proteins that we all have in our bodies now, right? And so proteins are long chains of amino acids, which are these little small molecules, right? And amino acids are actually thought to have been ubiquitous on the early Earth, right? So amino acids form very easily through really simple chemical processes. They're delivered to Earth from meteorites, which probably happened a lot more back on the early Earth than it does now, but it still happens now, actually. And so these molecules are thought to have been almost everywhere on the early Earth, right?
We
detect them.
And they would have been produced in various environments on the early Earth as well, right? So
yes,
not just coming from meteorites,
Yeah, that's right. And so like they would have actually been formed on the early Earth in addition to have been delivered, right? And I mean, some of them even form in like space dust clouds, right? These are really like simple fundamental molecules of the universe as we know it. And so
we used to think they were unique to life, and that was the big discovery with the Miller-Urey experiment. Is we're like, how on earth could anything like this be created? Because it's so specific. And then we now know they're everywhere.
And so so what I'm interested in is kind of the reverse process, is taking all the little amino acids and stitching them together to make chains of protein, right, without any biological machinery involved. And so that's actually a tricky problem. And so when you put amino acids in water, right, they don't just naturally stick together and link up, right, and make this like long chain. And so what we do is like kind of going back to that idea of Darwin's warm little pond, is we throw amino acids in a little body of water and we evaporate the water. You think of like an environment, something like a tidal pool or something, where water would kind of come and go on a daily basis. Like when it's hot, the water goes down, and when it's cool at night, the water comes back in when it's high tide or something like that, right? And so if you put amino acids in water and evaporate the water, you can make little tiny chains, but sometimes the little chains will they'll kind of like wrap around and they'll get stuck, and so they don't really grow much, right? And so that's kind of the problem that my area of research is trying to fix. And so what we've discovered is, if you take these other molecules that look almost identical to amino acids, but they only have one little difference, And in those like Stanley Miller type experiments, they form alongside amino acids. Like, so both types of molecules are present in those model prebiotic mixtures, and they're also for both present in meteorites. Like those same chemical mechanisms that make amino acids also make these. It just depends on things like the acidity or basicity or things like that.
Right? So we find amino acids and we find
these are called alpha hydroxy acids or hydroxy acids, right?
Yeah.
And
life does not use them, right? So
well, actually, no, that's not true. And so they're not used to make protein, right? But like one of the most common ones I use is called lactic acid or lactate.
Yeah.
Right. Like when you work out, you probably have heard people talk about, oh, you have too much lactic acid build up in your muscles, right? That has to do with like your metabolism, right? But lactate is a biological molecule, right? And so the molecule lactate looks just like an amino acid called alanine. The only difference is one has an OH, like an oxygen, and the other one has an NH2, which is a nitrogen, right? That's the only difference. Everything else is exactly the same, right? And so going back to around 2014, we had actually Ram Krishnamurthy, who you mentioned earlier, was the one who kind of one of the originators of this idea. He thought, hey, what if we took these hydroxy acids and amino acids and threw them together in the pot, right? And what if we evaporated the water? Then maybe we could make longer chains of like protein-like molecule, right? And we found out that it did, and it actually works. It works extremely well, and I joke that I am not a synthetic chemist. I'm actually trained as an analytical chemist, which means I like separate out molecules and figure out what different molecules are.
Yeah.
If I can make something, it's very easy, right? That's what I tell people. My undergraduates do it on the first day that they work in my lab, right? You literally just throw them in water and you heat the water. And when you put them back, when you add more water back, right? And you take them all, you dissolve the molecules and you analyze them, you have all these different chains. It's really that simple, right?
So let me try and back up here a little bit to give a little bit more perspective to people that are way outside of this field. So for a long time, we've known that amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins, those can be produced on the early Earth just fine. And there's hundreds of different ways that they can be produced. And they're not generally produced in high concentrations, but they are produced. We're also getting these, what was the name of the molecule again? Hydroxy acids. Right. We're also getting hydroxy acids produced alongside of them, and we just assumed that was just garbage, just junking up the mess that the prebiotic environment can produce. And in the past, a lot of these origin of life experiments, we would look at what types of molecules were available, and then because just like when you're trying to put together a puzzle, you're not trying to do the whole thing at once. You take baby steps. People were taking pretty high concentrations, pure concentrations of amino acids, and seeing what they do. Can these interact with each other and make peptide chains? Can they make little protein chains? And the answer was frustratingly no. Like they just keep on producing these little dead end particles. And so Ram is like, well, let's just make it dirtier. Let's make it dirtier like in real life and throw in these other molecules and see what happens. And when that happened, you were getting these chains to form. Mm-hmm. Now, those chains, the reason that we think they're cool is because they can fold up into three-dimensional shapes and they can act as enzymes. A lot of them won't do anything at all, but some of them can happen to have enzymatic properties. And depending on their sequence, they're going to fold up in a particular shape and they're going to have a specific enzymatic property. And so they can dramatically transform the types of chemistry that can now happen in that environment. You get an emergence of new properties just by creating a chain of protein instead of having individual amino acids. So that's why this is something we've been wanting to do for a long time, and your research found a way to do this. So.
Well, yeah. So I will just give a caveat to that. So we are right now. What we're trying to do is look at their kind of behavior and their activity, or like working as enzymes, right? And so we feel like we've come up with one way that life could have, or like prebiotic chemistry could have made little protein chains, right? Like there are other ways. Other researchers are working on this problem also. And I guess now kind of a direction that we want to take is let's start looking for function. Like, can these things, like you said, like fold up and actually do like carry out processes and things like that, right? And so that's really where we want to go next.
Yeah. So, but right now you just been asking the question, can nature build these? And now that the answer seems to be yes, I mean, obviously this is prebiotically plausible in Pyrex, so it's happening in the lab, but it does seem prebiotically plausible now. And of course, there's people debate on what that means and how you can really demonstrate that. But the so now you guys are looking at function. How long are the chains you're getting, these depsipeptide chains? So it's a combination of amino acids, and how long are they getting?
Yeah, so let me give some perspective first, right? So like proteins in life today, so John had mentioned the term peptide. A peptide is just a really short protein, right? They're the same thing. And so like we have peptides and proteins in our body that carry out functions that are really short, just a couple amino acids long, and they, like some of the peptides in our brain that deal with brain chemistry are actually very short. And we have huge, giant, million amino acid, like maybe not a million, but like tens of thousands. I mean, like giant protein complexes, right?
I think there is one in the muscle cells that is over 1 million. I could be wrong, but
I mean, right. So
huge.
The size and scale of proteins is, I mean, it's logarithmic. Like it's like many orders of magnitude difference, right?
Yeah. What's the smallest peptide we're normally using?
Like the biology uses. I mean, we have ones that are just a few residues long, right? And so like leucine and keflin is a neuropeptide. It has 5 amino acids, right?
Yeah.
It's YGGFL, right?
Okay.
And so and they're short. I mean, there's shorter ones than that too, right? And so
a lot of venom molecules are
that's right.
Tiny peptides. Yeah.
I would say that the majority of proteins in our body are, like hundreds to thousands of amino acids, maybe.
Yeah.
Right. And so the chains that we're making are not that long yet. Right. And so we're making ones that are, like 20, like 15, 20, 25 residues at length at the most. Right. But one of the things, so a really important aspect of this has to do with what's called solubility. Right. And so different molecules can dissolve or not dissolve in different solutions. Right. And so kind of the classic, and it has to do with something called polarity, which is, do molecules have, do they share their electrons evenly across a molecular bond, right? And so everybody says like dissolves like. So polar molecules, which do not equally share electrons in a bond, like water is a classic example of that, right? And so everybody knows that water is H2O. The oxygen, spends more time holding on to electrons than the 2 H's do, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what we call a polar molecule, where if you have something like gasoline, right? Gasoline has a lot of carbons and hydrogens, but they equally share electrons. So that's like called nonpolar, right?
Yeah.
And so if you mix water and gasoline, they don't mix, right? They layer. They don't mix well together, right? And so that's a really fundamental idea in chemistry, is understanding things called about polarity and how different molecules dissolve in different liquids, right?
Right.
And so proteins are these really huge chains, right? And so how do you get a huge molecule to dissolve in water? Is like you said, the protein has to fold in on itself, and all of the polar parts of the molecule are on the outside because they touch the water, and all the nonpolar parts are on the inside, and they're like hidden from water.
In a modern evolved protein,
In a modern protein. That's right. And so what drives that is in large part, is the sequence of the protein, right? The amino acids themselves that are involved in that chain, right? Mm-hmm. So different amino acids have different polarities associated with them. And some of them dissolve better in water than others, or some of them like water more than others, right?
Yeah.
And so one of the challenges that we are facing is, when we just take like simple amino acids and put them in that little wet dry pond and kick out these molecules, right? is when you have all of the same type of amino acid, or just like two types of amino acid, a lot of times they don't have enough polarity for them to dissolve well as they get longer, right? The longer ones tend to not dissolve in water.
So they'll just float.
Or they'll
sink.
like stick on the walls or things like that, right? Yeah. And so what we really need to do is we need to introduce more complex mixtures of amino acids, including ones that are polar, so that we have enough polarity that these things can stay in solution as they get longer and longer and longer, right?
Yeah.
And so the challenge of that is more of kind of like an analysis problem, right? And when you throw in all these different amino acids together, you get these really complex mixtures of molecules, right? That's what I love. That's what I'm trained to do. So I'm an analytical chemist. So I like to separate out all these things. And we can sequence the proteins using a technique called mass spectrometry. Yeah. That's what I'm trained in. I'm a trained mass spectrometrist. And so we can use that technique to actually break apart the little proteins, like amino acid by amino acid, and read the sequence that way.
Yeah, that's
it's not as quick and easy as doing DNA sequencing, though, right? And so DNA sequencing genome sequencing is much, you can read a whole human genome now, the test, in just minutes, right?
Yeah.
But there's only 4 in DNA, right? In RNA, there's only 4 possible monomers, right? And so in modern proteins, there's 20 amino acids, right? But we think that on the early Earth, there were way more than 20 amino acids, right? We think there were hundreds of possible, or maybe thousands of possible amino acids.
And life just ended up choosing 20 out of that.
Yeah, right. It's almost like a funnel. Like we started with this group, but then some of these were more effective than others. So we kind of honed in and evolved on like the ones that we really like to use, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm also interested in making little proteins with amino acids that we don't use in biology today, right? I think that asks a lot of interesting questions. Like, what if we make little proteins of like weird amino acids, and let's compare how those proteins work versus the ones that we use in biology, right?
And we might find that the 20 that biology uses was some sort of weird accident, or maybe they work better for certain situations, and that's why natural selection favored them.
Yeah, I mean, people have made arguments suggesting that our 20 amino acids are kind of like an optimized amount, right?
Mm-hmm.
I liken it to letters of the alphabet, right? And so we have 26 letters in the English alphabet, and the number of words you can make with those 26 letters is effectively infinite, right?
Right.
Where if you had an alphabet of 4 letters, the number of words you could make would not be as good, right?
Yeah.
And so really the power of proteins is the ability to do all these different behaviors based on their sequence of amino acids, right? That's really their strength. But DNA is better for storing information, though, just because it's a much sturdier, and it's actually, the fact that you only have 4 bases is actually a good thing. You don't want too much information storage, right? So things get more complex kind of as you read the information and express the proteins.
You get a lot of noise, yeah. I just want to hammer home this, like how it is that proteins work a little bit. So a protein in the body is a chain of amino acids. The sequence causes it to fold in on itself to form a glob, and in a very specific 3-dimensional shape. I had someone ask earlier about the chaperone proteins. How would you get proteins to emerge without chaperone molecules? And if early on, a lot of proteins in our bodies today, their folding is guided by other molecules that help them fold in a proper way. But if you don't have those other molecules to help them fold in a proper way, what's going to happen? You'll get misfolded proteins that end up being garbage. And so you'll just have to make more protein because a certain percentage of them are garbage. So that would have been something that evolved later on. But we're talking about really small proteins. You said you're getting about 20 long, or 12, between 12 and 20, yeah?
Right now, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have ideas in place already to how to make them longer and more dissolvable.
Yeah.
still, right? But
In a
we haven't.
in a prebiotic setting. Yeah.
Yeah, but we haven't done that work yet. That's
Yeah.
something that we're interested in doing in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the other thing, so hopefully that's clear to everybody. And then the other thing that I wanted to point out is that Origin of Life gets a lot of criticism for using really pure chemistry, because obviously in the origin of life there wouldn't have been pure amino acids of any type. Ram Krishnamurthy has really pushed for dirtier chemistries, and it's because of people like you who can do the hard analytics that's making this possible. In the past, it was just not possible to analyze a dirty mixture. So you could make do these dirty chemistry experiments all you wanted, but there's no way to see what the heck is going on in there.
That's right.
And so it's recent innovations, and a lot of innovations even at the center for analyzing dirty mixtures of chemicals to see what's happening. And this is a really cool time in Origin of Life, because we're just starting to really look at, okay, we understand how amino acids behave in essentially pure water. What happens when you add more garbage in there, more chaos into the system? And we're actually seeing that it helps more than hinders. And a lot of these experiments, like the one that you found, it was adding what we thought was junk into the system that actually made the system work, which is really cool.
Yeah, and I will say, as personally, because I'm a chemist who does all that analysis, I like the complex mixtures too, right? Yeah. I like things when they're a little messy, and it makes it more fun that way, in my opinion. But I also do think that there is a real value and a place for kind of more like reductionist approaches.
Yeah.
Right, where you just take a simpler system and you really like break it down to its components and really understand the basics of how it works and things like that. I think that there's room for all that.
And, yeah, absolutely. Like, we need to understand how these interactions happen. We need to understand exactly what's going on, and the only way to do that is pretty hardcore reductionism, right?
Yeah, and I think the field, I think there are certain kind of tensions that all Origins of Life research deals with, right? So like one of them is kind of was brought up earlier, like metabolism versus like information storage, right? One of them is kind of like a more reductionist approach, which I would say, at times was maybe more common historically, just because, like you said, like we were limited in our ability to analyze those products and things.
Yeah.
Versus a more like system view where things are messy, right? And it might be more plausible from a prebiotic standpoint, but again, when it's messy, it's much harder, right? So you're taking on a lot of challenge when you make things messy, and that's still true. I mean, that will always be true. And I would say another one of those areas is kind of like a bottom-up approach versus a top-down approach, right? So I'll explain what I mean by that. So a bottom-up approach would be starting from the really building blocks of molecules, right? Starting from amino acids and little like bases and things like that. Can we make protein? Can we make RNA? Can we make molecules that look like them, even if they're not exactly the same, right? Which is kind of what we do. Or there's a top-down approach that looks at biology now, right? And in particular, like what are the shared aspects of all biology of life, that we think that those components would have been present in that LUCA, that last universal common ancestor, right? Mm-hmm. And kind of working your way back down to more simpler things from there, right? But there's a gap there, right? So we have this top-down approach, we have this bottom-up approach, but there's a lot of space there in the middle,
right?
And in truth is that's where we have a lot of area to grow, because I am more of a bottom-up chemist, right? Mm-hmm. But when you go to Origins of Life research meetings, there are both top-down people and bottom-up people, but the hard part is, where do those meet? And we don't know yet, right? I think
and there are people working at weird spots in the middle too, but they're
that's
just
right.
kind of wherever there was a hint as to how something might have happened, that just like a puzzle, it's growing out from there. And I to reiterate that, you're saying that in Origin of Life research, some people are really focused on bottom up. Some people are looking at the cell and looking what's the most minimal type of cell, and then what's the most minimal evolving system. And they're trying to make predictions as to where the bottom up needs to eventually lead to, right?
Yes, that's right.
So that's very important. So yeah, it really is this like people working on a puzzle from different directions to
Hmm.
eventually meet in the middle. And not only do we not have, not only is there a gap in the middle, but there's actually no good way to tell how big that gap is,
We don't
because
know. That's
yeah,
right.
yeah,
Yeah. It's probably huge.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is not an easy problem. It some people seem to think that it should be easy. Like if it happened in nature, it should be easy. But one of the things I like to talk to people is like, I learned to throw a basketball into a hoop, and that was easy for me to do naturally. But to calculate what I'm doing and to actually scientifically describe what I'm doing, if you talk about neurotransmitters and you talk about just the equation of how does my brain calculate this and what's going on, like I can't do that. And that's way harder. And so the things that we're doing in origin of life chemistry, it's a lot of work. It's extremely difficult, and it's extremely fascinating. I'm just really, I love going and seeing what you guys are doing, seeing the problems that you're dealing with, seeing how people are solving it. It's been absolutely fascinating to be
Yeah,
fly on the wall.
I'd like to build on that real quick. So,
Mm,
I think that the argument that everything needs to be easy, I think there is some truth to that, but also there's not, right? And so, um, I do think that, for some process to have been a key part of the chemical evolution that led to life, I think
yeah,
there needs to be an element of universality to it, right? Like I go back to amino acids. Like amino acids are made in outer space. Amino acids are made on Earth.
yeah,
These are like really fundamental molecules that form through simple chemical processes, but they're like the end product of a lot of these roots, right? And so, I think there is a kind of a universality to that. But also, like you said, right, it's not simple to find something that is simple, right?
right,
you
right,
know
right.
like when you're looking for something simple, usually what you find are a million things that are really complex, or like are dead ends, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And so that's the hard work, right? Is finding these kind of universal processes and getting past all these other processes that are not, right? Like that's a really hard thing to do. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we face as researchers in this field.
yeah. I just got a question. What can common people do to help accelerate origin of life research other than voting? Uh, you know, so one thing you can do, folks, is you can like and share this video. But I don't. Do you have? I don't want to derail. So if you just want to spend like 10 seconds on that, like I don't want to derail where we're going with the chemistry here. But
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll kind of take a step back and just argue that basic science research has real value, right? Like it's
yeah,
super important that the National Institute of Health do cancer research and do like mental health research and all that. Like that's super important, right? But there needs to be enough of the pie that we can do that and we can still do basic science, right? And I
right,
think some people would argue that origins of life science kind of falls in that basic science category. Like I'm not trying to cure cancer. I'm working on like kind of fundamental problem. But there are tons of applications of what we do outside the origin of life also, right?
yeah,
And a lot of really basic science has led to huge discoveries that no one had ever thought of 30 years prior, right? And so I think it's important just to like support support candidates who fund basic science research, right? I think that's really important, and to emphasize to people that even if my research doesn't immediately address something like cancer or diabetes or something like that, that doesn't mean that it doesn't have value, right?
right. And we don't know when we're doing. The National Science Foundation. They exist to fund projects that are not. We don't yet know how they're going to be applicable. We don't
They're
know if
not
they're.
directly
Yeah.
health related. Yeah.
And we realized we needed to be doing that because I think really World War II was it
It was Cold
was
War. Yeah, that's right.
yeah, and World War II and the Cold War is the race
Yeah.
to the bomb and the race to space. We realized, oh, we need to understand how the universe works in order to even invent as the starting points for all of this. And so the National Science Foundation was like, okay, we just want to fund, we want to set aside a chunk of the U.S. tax money for basic fundamental research, and Origin of Life is, falls into that. So the Center for Chemical Evolution is funded by the National Science Foundation and
also
NASA.
partly by NASA. Yeah. So just to touch on the NASA element, right? So NASA does support a lot of Origins of Life work too, because it's directly related to a lot of their missions to look for signs of life elsewhere, right?
Yeah.
Origins of life and astrobiology are really intertwined fields, right?
Right.
And the experiments that we do help people at NASA or people in like the European Space Agency or whatever, like when they're designing a probe to go to Mars or to go to a moon of Jupiter or to go to a comet, like they're putting little chemical instruments on those probes, and like they want to know, like, what are we looking for, right?
Yeah.
Like what molecules are we trying to find, right? Like what molecules are important. And those conversations are always changing, and like there's no set in stone like this molecule is a biomarker, right?
Right.
People argue about what biomarkers are all the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's not something that we've reached a consensus on yet.
Yeah.
But what we do is directly related to that, and so NASA does support this kind of work as well.
Yeah. Hey, sorry, I think I derailed you on the explaining your research, but we were at the point where you were saying that we know that we can make peptide chains that are about 20 long. We think we can make them a lot longer. You're using much dirtier mixtures now of amino acids. You're exploring even non-biological amino acids, the types that can be created in these environments.
Yes.
And the next big step is to look at functionality. What can these things even do? Are they folding up? Are they able to catalyze other reactions? And then I've gotten another question about left-handed versus right-handed amino acids. Are you guys exploring dirty mixtures of that as well, and how that
that's a great question. So actually, let me answer the left-handed versus right-handed question first.
Okay.
Because I'm really interested in that. And so for those of you who don't know, so all of the amino acids in our proteins in biology are left-handed, right? And so a lot of organic molecules have what's called chirality or handedness. So it's basically just like your two hands. So my hands are essentially identical, but they're mirror images of each other, but I can't overlay them without changing something, right? If I overlay them this way, I turn it around.
Yeah.
And so they're non-superimposable kind of mirror images of each other, right? And that's a really fundamental property in chemistry and also in biochemistry, right? So biological amino acids are left-handed in proteins, and like all the sugars in like nucleic acids are like a certain handedness as well, right? And so we actually do study making these little chains with both left and right-handed amino acids, right?
Yeah.
And that has implications for how these fold, right? As the different bonds go in different directions, that changes how things can fold. It also can change how these things can like self-assemble or like stick to one another.
Yeah.
Right. How they can kind of aggregate. And I think that's a really interesting area of study. And so, because abiotic amino acids, like amino acids in meteorites or ones made by like the Miller-Urey experiment, most of them are equal mixtures of left and right-handed, right?
Yeah.
And so certain people are studying how we could have kind of purified like all just one hand of amino acid in biology, like, and at what stage would that have happened? Would that have happened at the monomer level, like when they're just free amino acids? Would that have happened when they're in the chains themselves? Yeah. And like some of the chains like break down easier than other ones.
Yeah.
We don't know, but there's a lot of really cool research going on that. There's a well-known chemist who I would say is probably the world expert on it. Her name is Donna Blackman. Mm-hmm. At the Scripps Research Institute in California.
Yeah.
And she does really cool stuff about how like when amino acids when they crystallize, when they form solid crystals, like sometimes you can exclude like all the left-handed ones or all the right-handed ones based on how they crystallize and form solids. Really cool stuff is going on in that field.
So, let me just poke at this to explain, to maybe point out why this is a problem that needs to be solved. Is it because, so life today only uses 20 amino acids out of hundreds of possible amino acids.
Yeah.
And then that hundreds of possible amino acids is even bigger than just the hundreds, because almost all the amino acids come in two forms. They come in the left-handed form and the right-handed form. So
That's right.
So life, if we want to get to something like a modern cell, we need to explain how we selected the 20 amino acids that life uses and the specific handedness of those 20. And so that's a lot of explaining to do, right? Like, because if you have a chain that has more than just the normal 20, well, you just increased the complexity. Like, your chances of getting two of those chains to come about in an abiotic reaction is way smaller if you have more than 20 amino acids. And because we have way more than 20 amino acids, plus we also have this handedness, it seems almost impossible that you'd ever get the same two proteins to emerge abiotically twice. So if something was really useful, well, it's only going to be around for a few reactions before it breaks apart, and then you'll never find that molecule again if we're really starting from a truly random starting point. So some people think that maybe these amino acids were filtered by the environment before they became chains. Yes. Other people are looking into them being filtered, like the certain chains will maybe a chain built of all left-handed amino acids will only interact will mostly interact with other chains of left-handed amino acids. And so you can get the sorting to happen either before or after chain formation.
Yeah, I think most people in the field would argue that the earliest proteins and peptides and proteins, like the earliest chains, probably had mixtures of left and right-handed monomers.
Yeah.
But maybe like the ones that were mixed were not as stable, or maybe they were unable to form structures. So they're really common structural forms that areas of proteins will make. One is called an alpha helix, where it makes like a turn, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one's called a beta sheet, where it makes these like flat sheets, right? And those are really fundamental in all proteins in biology and of life, right? Mm-hmm. And people argue, well, if you had mixed left and right-handedness, you probably wouldn't be able to make as good of those structures, and the proteins wouldn't be as stable, or they wouldn't be able to carry out reactions, things like that, right? And so that's one thought on that issue. But it's that field is wide open. There are a lot of people are working on it, but I think there's a lot of stuff we can learn.
Yeah, there's a lot of possible solutions that I've seen that are published, but there's no agreement on to what actually was happening. Yeah. All right, and where were we on your research? Maybe.
Well, I mean, we are doing research on that, right? Yeah. So we're doing studies about left and right-handed amino acids when we make our depsipeptide chains.
Yeah. So and these depsipeptides, how much, what percentage of a chain is amino acid versus I keep forgetting the name of the other molecule.
Hydroxy acid.
Hydroxy acid.
That's actually a great question. And so one of the things we really like about this specific system is that, so we call the way we make the chains, we call that wet-dry cycling, right? So we put the two types of molecules in water, we evaporate the water, and then we add water back, and we evaporate the water, and then we add it back in these repeating cycles, right?
Yeah.
And the more cycles that you do, the content of the chains becomes more amino acid and less hydroxy acid. So they essentially kind of convert to more like a biological peptide or protein as you do more of these wet-dry cycles. And the reason for that is that the bonds that stick the hydroxy acids together are not as strong as the ones that stick the amino acids together, right? And the amino acids actually can come in and replace a bond that two hydroxy acids used to have.
Yeah.
And so the amino acids are kind of more the end product, and they're more stable over time, which is one reason why we think, right, why would biology pick amino acids to form proteins and not these hydroxy acids? Because the hydroxy acids those chains would break down easier, right?
Yeah.
They're not as stable. But we actually see the content of these chains becomes more like biological proteins over time as we repeat these cycles.
That's really neat. So it's just a heat. It's just an evaporation and rehydration cycle,
That's it.
and
You're
that does
literally
it.
adding water and
Like,
evaporating the water off. Like anybody can do it.
yeah. So like a puddle that
Mhm.
forms with dew and then evaporates during the day could do this.
Yeah, I mean, this process probably happens on the Earth now, right? We're just not like, we're not, doesn't really matter anymore,
Right.
because
Yeah.
like, and also, the Earth biology, like Earth environments are so full of biological molecules already, right? Like there's
Yeah.
like just based on the life everywhere on Earth, right?
Yeah.
That it would be hard to tell the difference. Yeah,
And those molecules are eaten by everything, so you got a
that's right.
constant. Yeah.
Yep.
That's why you have to do these. You have to set up these labs that are completely purified environments. Spend a bunch of money on purifying water to the craziest degree ever. So there's no like ribozymes and stuff in it. Um, or RNAs. I was working with a lab in Corvallis, and all of their RNA work was not working. Like their RNA wouldn't last at all in their test tubes, and it's because they weren't purifying their water enough. They had RNA and enzymes that were digesting RNA that just all living cells excrete, and
Hmm.
so they're like, "Why, man? This RNA is garbage. It just dissolves right away," and it was because they had, yeah, everywhere on the planet Earth, we find life and these biological molecules. So it gets really tricky when you're doing these experiments to try and purify that out. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, trying to, I think we've kind of outlined your work pretty well. Is there anything else you really want to drive home about your particular, like something you just love about your research that you wanted to mention?
Um, sure. Yeah. So I work at a school where all my students are undergraduates, right? I don't
Yeah.
have PhD students that work with me. Like a lot of my collaborators that do at other schools. I really like working with college students. I think it's really fun.
Yeah.
And the researchers in my lab, they're usually 18 to 22, so they're quite young. And this is sometimes their first foray into scientific research. And so I think it's
Yeah.
really cool that they get to work on real origins of life chemistry problems,
Yeah.
just as college students.
Yeah. That's
And
cool.
it really kind of whets their appetite for science, whether or not they go into research as a career. Like a lot of my students have gone to med school and things like that, right?
Yeah.
But I find that they really enjoy doing basic science research. Yeah.
That's really cool. How do you get them caught up to where, I mean, for me, it probably took a year or so of reading books. Nick Hud, he was awesome. He bought me a bunch of books and sent them to me, just to kind of wrap your head around the current state of the field. Took, I really hours and hours. I mean, it was months of almost full time work for me to wrap my head
Yeah.
around it.
You can't ask a college freshman or sophomore to do that right away.
Yeah.
I find something for them to work on, like I find a research problem for them to work on, and then kind of give them stuff as they go, right?
Yeah.
I teach them what they need to do they need to know to do the research itself first, and then I can kind of build in some of the background and talk more about the field as we go. I take them to our scientific meetings, right? That's where they learn a lot of a lot of what's going on in the field is
Yeah.
they actually sit in on other people's talks and hear what they're researching. That's really helpful. Some scientific literature can be a little hard to approach for college age students, right?
So can
Um,
Origin of Life conferences, but
or
yeah.
I mean that can be true. That's true for me
Yeah.
sometimes. Sometimes I'll read a paper where I'm like, I have no idea what's going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I get them started on the research itself and explain their problem, and then kind of show them things as they go along. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I want to. We're coming up on an hour and a half here, and I want to, be respectful of your time. But I really wanted to give you a chance one more time because, really, you are special in Origin of Life. Not just that you are a practicing Christian and an origin of life chemist, but that you're so open about talking about it. And so I was curious if you could tell us just what would you say to our Christian viewers that are struggling with evolution and origin of life science? What would be your 2 cents to give to them on how to
Sure.
deal with this
Yeah,
conflict?
yeah, I would go back to that idea that that Bible teacher taught me when I was in high school is that, um, if you believe that your religious text, like something like a Bible or whatever religion you are, has real meaning and real value, right? Um, then you have to remember, first of all, that if you're having a conflict about how you read something or you believe something and how it gels or meshes with the science, right? Um, you have to realize that maybe the problem is how I'm interpreting that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe these two things aren't fundamentally opposed to each other. Maybe it's just I'm interpreting it that way, right?
Yeah.
Or maybe I'm missing something, right?
Mm-hmm.
And being open to seeing your own beliefs with fresh eyes, and also being open to science itself, right? Like the idea that scientific research, if this world, if this universe was created, then it should tell us something about the entity that made it, right? And um, and there's like those two things. If you're a religious person, right? If it seems like they conflict, right? And that happen, like you said, that happens a lot, right?
Yeah.
That means that maybe I'm misinterpreting how I'm looking at my religion and that religious text. Maybe I'm misinterpreting the science. Maybe I'm misinterpreting both. I think that happens a lot, right?
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that those two entities themselves are fundamentally opposed to one another, right? It's a lot. I think a lot of time it's interpretation, and I think that certain areas have a right interpretation, right? The science on evolution is very clear, right? I mean, one only needs to look at genetic testing, right? We can basically trace the tree of life through genetic testing, right?
Yeah.
Right. And so the evidence for evolution is overwhelming. And in a sense, it's undeniable if you look at the science itself, right? And so typically when people have issues with crises of faith or things like that, it usually has to do more with the faith than the science. I would argue, like
Mm-hmm.
it's more, I think a lot of times those hurdles that you have to get over are maybe have to do with personal theology. They have to do with how you're interpreting religious texts, like how you see how your religious worldview is. But like on things like evolution, the science is very clear. There are other areas where the science is not necessarily clear yet, right? Like origins of life science is an open field. Like we're making huge discoveries, but we have a long way to go. But that doesn't mean that we won't get there. And I think that that's a danger too that sometimes religious persons will fall into, is they're like, oh, like they're never going to figure this out. Well, maybe they will,
Yeah.
right? And then if they do, you're going to have a crisis of faith, right? But kind of I've heard people call that like a God of the gaps mentality, right? So like
Yeah.
we can't explain this gap in science, so God did it, right? Well, like I think you need to be careful with that idea, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess just to summarize, I would just say if you have faith and you have science, right? I don't think these things fundamentally oppose one another. It has to do with interpretation,
Okay.
and right. And if the science is very clear and that contradicts something of your faith, right, then maybe you're interpreting something in your faith incorrectly, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that your faith necessarily has to just disappear, right? It could, right? I mean, that's your prerogative, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't necessarily think it has to be one or the other.
Yeah. Now, me, not being religious, I mean, obviously, I don't feel that conflict, right? Because
Yeah,
I'm not. But our worldviews in general, we come across contradictions between what we're observing and how we think the world should work a lot. And sometimes that's because our worldview is wrong, and so we can just give up on that. Other times it's because, yeah, like you say, you're misinterpreting something. And I think as humans, we're almost too excited to think that everything needs to work start to finish. That we have to understand every contradiction and every question before we can be comfortable in our own skin. And I think that if you go through life that way, doesn't matter if you're religious or not, like you're going to have trouble being comfortable, because there's lots of ideas, lots of things that we see that conflict with other ideas, and we just can't, we don't know why that is. One of the examples that I give on this is, if you think that gravity should make all objects fall to the ground, and then you see a bird fly, you could have a a crisis and oh my gosh, this bird's violating the gravity. But if you understand that, well, the bird is flying by pushing on air, and there's air pressure, and this all works actually because of gravity pulling these air molecules towards the earth, and then so you just see that there's more to the explanation. And so I would encourage people not to require that everything makes sense in their own worldview before they can go and be active in the world. Like we can live with a certain degree of contradiction, and that's okay.
It's okay to say I don't know, right?
Yeah.
I say I don't know all the time, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So, well, Jay, any last words of wisdom before we end things here?
Can't think of anything. Thanks so much for having me, John. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is really cool. I think I'm gonna try and get some more people from the center on. Nick's expressed interest, and a couple other people are interested in coming on. I think this could be a really cool series of interviews with people at the center. So
yeah, and just a caveat: these are my opinions, right? These are not the
right.
opinions of my employers or my funding agencies. Right? These are my opinions, so.
Yeah. And tell us again the name of the organization that you work with seminaries that are branching.
Called Science for Seminaries. It's a program through the AAAS Dialogue on Science and Religion.
Are you a volunteer there, or they actually have grant money to help you?
So they're supported by a grant. So I'm like a science advisor for them. So they have people that run that program full time.
Yeah.
I just help out with things here and there.
Oh, cool. Well, yeah, it's really awesome that you're doing that. It really is we live in an era of culture wars that are getting out of hand lately. So it's really cool that you're doing that outreach stuff. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Well, thank you once again, and stay curious, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and share it on social media. And I will see you next week. Next week is actually going to be Bert Hubert. He's going to be talking about the cell from a programming perspective. He's done research in biology, but he actually started out his career working in computer science, and he has there's some really cool parallels that he likes to point out there. And we actually pre-recorded that because schedule conflicts, but I will be in the live comments responding to people's questions there next Sunday. That's 11 a.m. as usual for Sunday Morning Science, and that's going to be a really, really fun conversation. So hopefully I'll see you all there. Until next time, stay curious.